Welcome to MoveTube. My name's Ralph. I'm with Owen. Hi, Owen.
Hi.
We've just been watching Three Crowns of a Sailor by Raúl Ruiz, a Chilean director who worked in France quite a lot. He also made a film called City of Pirates. He also tried to adapt Proust's Time Regained, Time Remembered.
That was very biased. Tried to adapt. Putting your cards on the table.
My cards on the table are that Proust is very, very difficult to adapt, and every great filmmaker, Schlondorf, Ackerman, Ruiz, none of them have really managed to adapt it. Even Ruiz, whose filmmaking style I would say is very, very akin to the writing style of Proust. We watched Three Crowns of a Sailor, which is a deeply weird and strange film that exists in a very dreamlike logic. It is like City of Pirates. Has a naval theme to it.
Loves the sea.
There's a sort of guy who tells a story. He's doing a deal with someone where he needs to get 3 crowns, and he talks to this sailor who gives him his life story, and he challenges him on various aspects of it. The story involves him falling in love with
various
prostitutes,
sex work.
So kind of like it was quite hard to follow. We're basically kind of doing this because we want to sort of investigate whether it's possible to like make good films in a style that is like in total opposition to what we're told good films are made of. You know, Ruiz's work is very fragmentary. It's very oniric, dreamlike. It's very fantastical. It's quite twee, unfortunately. But you know, there's obviously something there that anyone who's interested in the avant-garde or innovation pricks their eyes up to. How did you watched City of Pirates and Time Regained earlier this week, and now together with me you watched
Three Crowns of a Sailor, 3 crowning sailors.
What did you make of it?
I'm going to reference you because earlier in the week when I talked to you, you expressed the view that it's strange how all of the ingredients of, and I agree with this view, all the ingredients of Ruiz are interesting, formally, in theory, formally exciting. They're the kind of stuff we like, which is the oniric, the fragmentary, the kind of hallucinatory. How he's always really struggled to make a standout banger. Yeah. A film that really resonates with the sublime, and really... And I think part of the, one thing we're saying while we're through this film is that, if you read his Poetics on Cinema, his book, and if you look at anything he said about his films, he was actively interested in exposing the kind of narrative mechanics of cinema and kind of obliterating them. Yeah. The as it were, like in a Godardian sense, like the Hollywood Moss film complex. He was interested in exploding that. But whereas Godard used the kind of tissue paper, he used the kind of foundations of Hollywood cinema to reimagine it. Ruiz is not doing that. He wants to create an entirely blank slate and create films that are like, if anything, like more like trance film, post-war American trance film, experimental avant-garde tradition of like Maya Deren, which is basically surrealistic. It's like, what if Chien Andalou, but, sort of modern, and a long feature film with dialogue. I don't know. It's weird because in theory, I found City of Pirates more compelling than Three Crowns for a Sailor. I think Three Crowns for a Sailor feels like the example of what he was trying to do, which was to create an entirely fractal film that had no narrative tension. That's the thing he wants to obliterate from film is narrative tension. Yeah,
the one thing that makes films watchable.
Yeah. So like the thing about a film is, it's light at 24 frames a second. And he's, it relies on, historically theorists of film on things like montage and the association between elements. For him, he wants to kind of almost give each element, to make each element like a glistening jewel in a crown that kind of that sparkles independently of all the other jewels, right? And the problem with that is it makes it really myopic and hard to, like, we were watching it now and we're just like, you just don't care. Like, shorn of like it's not like we're
stunning shot after stunning shot, and
amazing, and it's not like we're enemies of experimental avant-garde cinema. Like, any listener to this podcast will know we love the shit, but here it just feels like you're just going, when you've been shopping for a really long time and you're like trying to buy like a shirt and you go to like 30 stores because you can't quite find the right one, and you're just exhausted and tired and overwhelmed and oversaturated. That's what it feels like. You reach a point of paralysis with this film where you just don't care. It just deflects off your eyeballs almost.
I see Ruiz as a sort of like cinematic explorer of uncharted territory, you know, because later in life he did these workshops, these film workshops in like around Europe, where he would get together a bunch of students and give them like a week or so to make a film. And some of the films he made later in life, like this one based on Chilean telenovelas, I think, are based on quite improvisatory or short-term kind of creative projects that are to do with generating inspiration in the moment. So in a way, I think he while never actually making like a masterpiece film, he did innovate in lots of ways. But it is a shame when you think of directors like Godard, René, Marker. You know, these are directors who did lots of different experimental films that go into uncharted territory. Some of them failing miserably, others are, you know, depending on your view, hugely successful. But they also did make films that most people agree are fantastic, you know, like...
Yeah, whereas Ruiz, you don't hear that kind of excitement around.
Yeah, he's not in anyone's top 10 or top 50, really. No. I mean, he has to be seen, I think, by someone who is interested in pushing the filmic form. But yeah, I think it is partly a doctrinaire resistance to, as you say, the Hollywood film style and the specific. I mean, he says in his book, The Poetics of Cinema, that, you know, he doesn't want people to relate to a particular character. He wants people to relate to the film itself and to the kind of like the juggling around of objects,
which makes it quite a modernist project in a way,
deeply,
exposing the conditions of its own making. Which is high modernism, but in the 1980s, which is weird. It's almost like that horse has bolted kind of within what film had done. By this point, the ground he was treading, that's why I mentioned this closest kind of analog feels like Maya Duren. It feels like that ground was well and truly trod in the 40s.
And film is funny in that way. Like, film hasn't really graduated to... I mean, there are obviously loads of avant-garde experimental films that have reflected turns in modernism and postmodernism and, you know, internet art or whatever, but like you know, the general cinematic era is romantic. Essentially, the general cinematic era is like Homeric almost, you know, like
which relies on a, you know, in the romantic tradition, relies on the quest or the ambivalent quest of a central character. Right, like it relies on that tension of a figure. Whereas the figure, say, 3 Crowns for a Sailor, our central figure in there is the eponymous sailor, whose life we hear, but because he is completely unmoored from context, because we know nothing about him, and because he has no overriding, he's just kind of loafs from place to place. He's caught up in this series of dream tableau, basically. You don't see it as part of this mythological quest. It's just stuff that happens to a guy. That's what it feels like. It's here's a guy. It feels like a dream. It's like it's a really good mirror image of what dreaming feels like, which is a series of discontinuous fragments which bear no meaningful relationship to each other.
On this dreaming point, he writes in his book, a few years ago, after reading the curious essay Dreaming by John Malcolm, I and a mathematician friend decided to write a book on dreams, and to do so we took to sleeping in the most desperate of places, in the street, while walking, beneath tables, during a meal, during a speech, or of course during a film. But
very easy to do.
It's during one of his own films, perhaps. Once we had acquired the ability to sleep at will, we devoted ourselves to examining the mechanism of sleep, and above all, the relation between the moments of sleep and periods of real life that frame them. It becomes clear to us that the moments of real life functioned like a film, with segments spliced together so as to produce the illusion of continuity. The only catch was that inside the seemingly compact image, each segment contained something like potential segments, in the same way that a sequence length shot creates close-up effects and imaginary changes of camera angle despite its rhetorical continuity. For all cuts are prohibited in such a shot. Clusters of dreamed images are superimposed on the visible ones, giving the impression that we see the real world from the perspective of dreams and oblivion, as in moments of profound drowsiness. So what he's saying is basically he kind of him and his mate imposed a form of jet lag on themselves. Kind of had that what my friend calls dog shit day, when you're like incredibly sleep deprived after you've been traveling, and you kind of keep waking up in a sort of confused state and keep having dreams that feel like where elements of the outside world sort of intrude upon them, and that, you know, within that slightly psychedelic almost experience, there is a kind of a match cut thing between real life and the dreamed life.
Yeah, they overlap and penetrate each other, and I think there's another segment in that book where he talks about the desire to narratively, I think I can copy it from the top of my head, is that there is a desire to create multi-dimensionality in the film, so that rather than a linear progression of a single reality, you are simultaneously seeing not only superimposed images, and he uses superimposition more in, I would say more in City of Pirates. He uses it to an extent here, often in the form of, I think, like seascapes and things that have been overexposed and overlaid on each other. We can talk about the sea.
And he uses shots like, the other unconventional thing he does is this split diopter lens thing, which you see it in Come and See once or twice. It's basically, for listeners, it's like a kind of some kind of optical process whereby something that's very close to the lens and something that's in the background are in focus
simultaneously.
But it's simultaneously while the middle distance is blurry.
Yeah, it bends your perspective.
And it's quite distancing, because unless you're like a kind of lens nerd like me, you tend to watch it and think this is normal, but something's off.
It's uncanny.
It's uncanny, exactly. And I think that it does work to an extent, but it does have this process of kind of taking us out of things a bit, and like
because he uses them really inconsistently. Because that's one of the things about him. He, like I'm saying about that multidimensionality, what he says in the book is he wants these different realities to emerge and arrive simultaneously at different orders, and what that does is he's kind of demonstrating that the idea of narrative as a narrative is not real life. It's imposed upon real life later. Film is obviously not real life. It's a construction of a reality. So what he's doing is he's trying to superimpose narrative. So he's formally creating superimposition, but he's also creating it from a narrative perspective, and that works with overlapping bits of dialogue. It happens with kind of these unusual dioptic shots. It happens with cuts between different angles and perspectives that kind of fold and wrap into each other, things that obscure the camera suddenly. Lots of really, sometimes it'll go from a very sharp black and white, really crisp shot to one where you've got obviously like layers of film imposed and kind of blown out on top of each other.
Yeah, and he's drawing on genre tropes. I mean, the film about the telenovela film is a very good example of this. You do have like moments of dramatic tension based on like very isolated moments of action or conflict. But basically in this film, you have this sort of, the whole thing is framed by this film noir style confrontation between the sailor and the other guy.
The student.
Yeah. And that has a kind of weird floating tension, but we're never really aware of what's at stake. And then so all the violence that occurs feels kind of curiously gratuitous. It feels like curiously like that death wasn't justified, or like...
Yeah, he's killed at the end by the student who he's been regaling this story to. And what happens is he then, through no real sleight of hand, in a kind of clumsy way, he reveals the story, what's really been happening, which is that the story of the sailor's life, he's been on this weird ship basically traveling the world, is actually a ship of the dead, and he was the one living person on it, and he dies and the student then takes his place and goes on this boat, and he kind of drops that at the end. And it's unusual because it's like for the whole film he's insisted on this kind of multimodal multi-dimensionality and superimposition, but at the end he's like, oh yeah, in case you didn't get it, this is actually what's happening here. And it's kind of obvious from the watching that is, and that kind of...
It wasn't really obvious to me, to be honest.
Oh, okay, fair enough. But
I'm not the best at following plots.
I mean, it's the thing, it's like, it's plotless, but he obviously at the end kind of like weirdly corpses it and is like, oh, no, I need to explain actually what was happening here. Yeah. It's weird. He doesn't fully commit ever. So that's what I was saying about this like grab bag of things. He'll use these dioptic shots. It's like, you either use them and integrate them fully into your film, but with it will be like he uses it like maybe 4 times in the film, 4 or 5 times, and over 3 hours almost. It's like, it's weird. It's just like he's suddenly like, oh yeah, I guess we can do that weird thing with the camera. Yeah. And then, oh, we can do this strange thing here. And it feels very discontinuous. And I know that's his point, but it never feels like the form and the content are really holding hands. It just feels like a weird
Beautiful shots, especially
beautiful.
with the sea and the sunset.
But he really could have like,
but you know, anyone can do that.
lent into that, you know, and really like, that's what I was frustrated about. It's like, it's so close to, he just doesn't ever commit fully to the aesthetic strategies that he's kind of exploring. Like, you know, I think one of the things about talking about genre, sorry, I'm rambling on, but it's one of the things about watching Allure is you spend the whole time going, oh, this is like this. He's one of those directors. So like the black and white kind of framing narrative, which occasionally erupts into the main narrative, like strike me down, but it kind of just reminded me of Wings of Desire.
Yeah,
it just
true.
reminded me of like
he's
these
almost
two
like
figures.
the Tarantino of watching art house films.
Fuck yes, that's it.
He's just creating a sort of like a kind of tribute in the way that, it's just a tribute act to like
a cum tribute to
sort of I mean, I do want to sort of, because that's the funny thing about art. Like, you can make an art, like what Godard did so brilliantly was he made like art house films that were like incredibly derivative of like mainstream action films. Yeah. And then there are a lot of like mainstream Hollywood films which are hugely derivative of art house films, but are kind of softening those things, making them more palatable.
Looking
like,
at you, Denis Villeneuve,
remake, all
kind
this
of stuff,
building, like taking the things that are kind of innovative out of art house and then like sanding them off and making them like integrate within like a and then, you know, Mark Kermode will say that it's like, oh, you know, very long takes or something, you know.
It's fucking slow cinema. What's that great Lav Diaz thing where he gets interviewed by Criterion, is it? And they're like, oh, like talk about slow cinema. And he's like, fuck off. Slow cinema doesn't exist. It's just film, man.
No, but he is slow.
He is very slow.
So I would be like, come on, Lav. Come on, Lav. You are much, just in relative terms, you are much.
He's the longest filmmaker.
You are much slower than like other filmmakers. Just as a, like, I don't know, like the only other unfinished business I have with Ruiz really is just like, you know, he kind of like, we both have gravitated towards him in some way, and we both sort of want something from him that we haven't quite received. Do you feel something to be learned as a filmmaker and as a film thinker fan from these kind of failed attempts at innovation? Is there something?
You answer first, because I think you want to answer that question.
Well, I feel fundamentally disappointed by him. I watch him and then I don't watch him for a long time, and then I try another one, and there is, I think, a dream in my head that it will be like Muriel by René or something, that it will, or like even you know, late Malick, which, you know, I'm all in favor of like an ambitious failure. You know, and like the way that Knight of Cups kind of struck me, which was like, oh, actually,
he does that really well
good,
though,
you know?
because he does have like but he does again have a narrative tension, like Malick.
And it's so simple, and you're not distracted by all the kind of weird nonsense. I feel like there's that sense, in the same way that in René, you know, one of the things I remember from René is that matchstick game, you know. Yeah. But obviously the matchstick game is rooted in a very primal sort of like power play between men, you know, in a kind of in a context of like sexual romantic anguish and anxiety. There are loads of elements of that in this film, but it doesn't really feel like there's
cohesive.
Yeah, it doesn't really feel like that context is stable enough for you to really concentrate. I mean, I just lose concentration. I mean, I don't know whether this is like just, you know, the TikTok generation just sort of failing to...
No, I think we're perfectly capable of like absorbing and being entranced by films which play good films which play in us.
Listen to the last...
But I think that's it. What, you know, what can I learn like from him as a filmmaker or in any capacity? I don't know. A lot of it just comes down to like small things like shot choice and things like that. You're like, oh, that's an interesting way to shoot this scene.
But that stuff is very intuitive. I feel
it's
like
very intuitive.
People who are good at that are good at that because they've just got an eye.
He's got an eye for it. I mean, because he's considering he was trained in theatre originally, which shows. It really shows. It does show, yeah. But a lot of his
there's a lot of offstage energy.
Yeah, but which is weird because like he's got a lot of interesting. His ability to put the camera in unusual places is really interesting, and like I think that's one of the exciting things. But he doesn't always do that. There will be a good 5 minutes where he's really putting the camera in odd places. Does it have any real relationship to the integrity of the film? No, but it's kind of interesting. It opens up some possibilities about how you position your camera. He does these great over shoulder shots where you see a bit of the side of the, you know, the character's face, and then you've got the dioptic, you know, kind of middle or far distance that's in focus, and they're quite interesting, almost like a peep showy kind of POV thing. He's got a really good way of like doing these tracking shots. He does great tracking shots, which are kind of Renéan in the way of they add this sweeping, otherworldly movement to otherwise quite static scenes. It's two people talking. He uses them a lot in this ballroom scene in the film, which is where the two people are dining in this weird ballroom. The student and the sailor, recounting the story in black and white. So he has all these really interesting strategies. Do you know what it's like? It's weird. It feels like Marguerite Duras does this better. India Song.
Oh yeah,
India Song
which
felt
we
like
reviewed
we reviewed fucking ages ago, but that felt like a more totalizing manifestation of this approach.
But that
to
had
filmmaking.
Continuity of place,
yeah, and character, and you were at least mildly invested. And here you don't invest.
And it was basically one note being drawn out, whereas this kind of like you would just lose your way because you'd be going on one sort of trajectory, and then suddenly he'd arrive at a brothel, and then something else would happen, and someone would get hit in the face, and it would just be like, I don't understand why any of these people are like, for me to be in front of something for 2 hours and not understand why people are doing things is a big ask, I think. And
I think so, because you're like, part of you is like, he's obviously dissatisfied with the fundamental building blocks of film, but it's like he hasn't presented a compelling alternative. He's cracked open loads of possibilities and opened loads of really interesting doors, but doesn't really walk through any of those doors properly. He looks through them, and I think it's like, well, why are you making films? It's like, actually, it's obviously like the kind of there's certain requirements imposed by film, and I'm going to sound a bit cynical, but I think there are certain requirements imposed by film which you have to meet in the least to justify as a film. Like,
on that subject, so just to kind of add detail to the thing I alluded to earlier, an old Hollywood saying claims that a film is a success when the viewer identifies with the hero. He accomplishes the action. He must finally win. I think that in any film worth seeing, you should identify with the film itself, not with one of its characters. You should identify with the objects being manipulated, with the landscapes, with all the characters, though this doubling can never take place until you have reached and gone beyond the hypnotic point. From this moment forth, you are in another film. Before the hypnotic point, we are watching a spectacle, a production. The images come to us. Now it appears that the images are taking off from the airport of ourselves, flying towards he's using basically employing loads of metaphors that he's kind of established earlier on in the book. But the most important bit about that extract is the first few sentences where he talks about you should identify with the objects being manipulated, the landscapes, all the characters. So there's this idea, and you see it in the City of Pirates, right, where there's this like bouncing ball that is like moving around and almost has more autonomy than the adults in the room, and the child as well has this kind of strange shifting around vibe. I mean, that's what's frustrating. I just don't agree with that. I just think it's a beautiful ideal. It's a transcendental idea. It's almost like a kind of object-oriented gelatology kind of vibe, but it just, I think Romer does that in a way. Certain filmmakers like Bresson do that thing where like, objects in the room kind of become as important as the characters.
They become a focus. It might be somebody carrying a cup of tea.
He's almost trying too hard.
I think, he's trying too hard. It's basically a diffusion tactic. So he's diluting focus everywhere, which I was saying about this kind of crown of jewels earlier. Everything is equally, emphasis is placed equally on everything. So there's not a single pressure point. It's evenly distributed over everything. And the problem with that is, how do you penetrate that wall of dense symbology, because everything is equally prioritized and privileged, and that's that's what makes the experience quite erratic, because you don't know where to look, you don't know how to look through his films, and they become. I mean, but when you read his book, that's kind of what he was going for. So in a way, he's a successful filmmaker in his own terms, but he's not a successful filmmaker insofar as kind of sustaining a conversation within film itself. And is that important? I don't know, but that's the thing. The frustration is you're continuing like, oh, this looks a lot like Jean Vigo, this looks like a lot like René, but not as good.
So that's the Tarantino effect.
That's the Tarantino effect. I mean,
the Magpie, the mixtape.
So City of Pirates felt more compelling because, again, but the thing is, he says that about not identifying with central character, but you do. Like in the City of Pirates,
you try your fucking best.
You try your best,
and then you meet resistance.
You're rebuffed
at every stage.
Because the woman in that, the girl, you kind of sympathize and invest in her character because you see most of the film through her eyes. You follow her. In this, you follow the sailor's story. In Time Regained, ultimately you follow Marcel's story. And I think what I actually found Time Regained really disappointing because it is a onerous, banal slog, and it makes Proust a deeply imagistic, optical, and joyful filmmaker, writer, lumpen and sterile and very boring. You know, it's a very, very boring film.
I would say that's largely down to like the and maybe reinforces that point people like to make about how like good books make bad films and bad books make good films. That, you know, that his work, the power of his work relies on the fact that you have to undergo an imaginative process in film. Those particular things are not being imagined; they're being shown.
Because he's literally just recreating scenes from
which is the wrong way to go around it.
Yeah,
I mean, a good adaptation of Proust should be almost unrecognizable.
It should be purely POV. It's like this thing because, you know, so much of Proust relies on Marcel's the work of memory and the optics of memory and the seeing of childhood and the joy and humor. And the thing is, Proust is funny because he's satirizing French bourgeoisie culture and upper class culture. Proust is formally exciting because of his long, like, absorbing, overlong sentences and his emphasis on seeing and optics. It's an interrogation of seeing, which is a film, you know, Ruiz is that filmmaker. He interrogates the act of seeing and perspective, but he just doesn't do it in Time Regained. Like, he suddenly just like turns the taps off suddenly, and he does a lot of it in, you know, these unusual perspectives and the superimposition. It's all there in the other films. He just, when it comes to Proust, he kind of, I think, the anxiety of influence, he's like, oh shit, I need to make the Proust adaptation. I think he just becomes suddenly overwhelmed by narrative because it's quite narratively quite a linear film, surprisingly.
On that note,
fuck, we were quite neggy about that.
Ruiz, sorry, Raul.
Ruined by Ruiz.
Yeah.
But it's still like, he shoots the ocean beautifully. So if you were to like...
So does David Attenborough. I mean, if you were to like stitch all of Ruiz's like ocean scenes together, and if you were an artist and you just shot ocean like that and you put it on a big screen in a gallery and that was just an art piece, that would be completely fine, even remarkable as a piece of art. Yeah, but that's ultimately like, but it's only aesthetic. Whereas Ruiz's triumph is like, is this sort of, it's this dream of a great film. I almost think like, if all his films had been deleted and all you had was like some of the stills, you would think, oh my god, this guy must be like the best director ever. Like not like Marker, but just like if you like found some stills. Oh,
you found like an archive, and you just
of his films, but you couldn't actually watch them. You'd be like, wow, this seems like.
You'd be really excited by it.
And then when you watch them, you're like, I can't get into this.
No,
it's terrifying.
There's also the melted skull of City of Pirates, which is funny. You know, at the end when she turns around to face the camera, and she's like, there's this weird melting skull of her face. It's just a bit shit.
Sex and death.
He does like
he does the elements. Yeah, he's just got a good
twee too much
psychoanalytic sort of. Yeah, he's just I mean, we don't like twee.
He's kind of Hitchcockian in that way.
Yeah, and I think he's a bit like Wojciech Has to an extent. But Wojciech has a linear through line, even though he's doing dream. There's enough kind of tension between form and content for that to work.
That is a man who isn't dreaming moving through a dream. Yeah. Whereas this is a dream.
This is just all dream, and so therefore there can be. I don't think you can. Film is a dream in such a way that you can't try and make it more a dream. It's like adding oil to oil.
Yeah.
Or something.
That works.
There's some metaphor.
That sounds like a Ruizian metaphor.
You know when you go to the skincare place and they're like, oh, have you got oily skin? Here's like an oily moisturizer or whatever.
Doesn't make sense.
And the oil takes away the oil. Because it kind of replenishes the oil. It tricks your skin into thinking it doesn't need to produce more oil.
That's really clever.
So it's a bit like that.
I have quite oily skin at the moment.
That's just pour some olive oil on the face.
Just don't do that. Extra virgin.
But there's that principle of the dreamness. It's like film is already dreamlike, so it's overproducing a dreamlike energy. Just even if it's just even if you're watching some shit rom-com, it's still like a dream world happening there. There's a level of construction and fiction happening that can't be kind of like.
I think that's it.
Can't be forced. We've fucking sorted it. We've diagnosed it.
We were a bit wary about. We're like, what are we actually going to say about Ruiz?
Yeah, I was thinking of calling off, to be honest.
The wind was like knocked out of our sails, but I think we've tacked into the Gulf Stream.
All right, that's as we always do. Thank you for listening, listeners.
And
stay safe. Get a booster.
Get your jab. Enjoy the fireworks because it's still
Yeah.
aggressively going on, and wrap up warm.
Indeed. Bye.
Bye. Retard.